The biggest mistake an HOA can make isn't planting trees on the wrong land. It's planting evidence. The smell of fresh cedar mulch drifted through the open window before I even stepped out of my truck. Then I heard it. The low hydraulic whine of a tree spade, the steady beep of a reversing loader, and the dull thud of root balls settling into freshly dug earth. For a second, I honestly thought one of my neighbors had hired a landscaping crew. Then I rounded the bend in my gravel driveway and saw 3 trucks, 2 trailers, and nearly 24 mature oak trees lined up across the southern section of my property. Men in bright safety vests moved with practiced efficiency, while a white luxury SUV sat near my old survey marker like it owned the place. Standing beside it was Patricia Holloway. She wore an expensive floral blazer that somehow managed to clash with every color around it. Oversized sunglasses, layers of sparkling jewelry, and the kind of confident smile that only comes from someone who has never been told no often enough. She was laughing with a local reporter holding a camera, while several residents from the subdivision applauded every new tree that went into the ground. One little girl held a shovel decorated with a green ribbon that read Community Tree Day. Patricia spotted me before I reached the fence line. Instead of looking surprised, she smiled even wider and waved as if I had arrived late to my own celebration. "Perfect timing," she called. "You should be proud. This is going to be beautiful for everyone." I stopped beside the weathered iron survey pin my father and I had uncovered together nearly 20 years earlier. My boot rested against it without anyone noticing. That tiny piece of steel had survived storms, floods, and decades of changing seasons. It also happened to mark the legal boundary of my family's land. Every single tree they had planted stood several feet inside it. I looked across the field without saying a word. Fresh soil stretched in neat rows where native grass had stood just yesterday. Irrigation tubing snaked across the ground like black veins waiting to disappear beneath mulch. Decorative stone markers already displayed the words Hollow Creek Community Greenbelt in polished bronze letters. Patricia stepped closer, lowering her sunglasses just enough for me to see the satisfaction in her eyes. "The neighborhood voted unanimously," she said. "Unused land should benefit the community." I glanced from the bronze sign to the camera pointed at my face. The reporter waited for outrage. Patricia expected an argument. The volunteers looked nervous, probably wondering whether they should keep digging. I simply nodded once. "You planted them in the wrong place." She laughed loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Grant, we checked everything." I looked down at the survey pin again. "Did you?" Her smile barely changed, but something flickered behind it for just a moment. Then she shrugged and motioned for the crew to continue. The machinery started again. Another oak descended into a perfectly measured hole. The sound of shovels scraping fresh dirt mixed with polite applause from residents who genuinely believed they were improving their neighborhood. None of them knew the land belonged to me. None of them knew I had already sent 2 certified letters, 3 emails, and a formal notice asking the HOA to stay off my property after hearing rumors about a landscaping project. Every receipt sat in a folder inside my truck. Every survey map was backed up digitally. Every property corner had been photographed with GPS coordinates months before this morning. I could have started shouting. I could have demanded the crew stop immediately. Instead, I reached into my pocket, opened the camera on my phone, and quietly recorded another minute of footage. The loader placing trees. Patricia giving directions. The bronze sign. The irrigation trenches. The reporter interviewing smiling volunteers. They all looked so proud of what they were building. They had no idea every shovel of dirt was making the paperwork easier. Patricia crossed her arms and admired the growing line of oaks, as if she had just created a public park from thin air. "People will thank us for this," she announced. I believed her. They probably would. At least until they discovered who actually owned the ground beneath every single tree. I have heard people call it an empty field more times than I can count, and every single time I quietly smiled because they only saw what was growing above the ground. They never understood what rested underneath it. My grandfather bought those 38 acres in 1964 with money he earned driving freight trucks across 3 states. He was not a wealthy man. He simply believed that land was one thing nobody could manufacture once it was gone. My father inherited that same belief, and by the time I was old enough to carry a post-hole digger, I had already memorized every fence line, every drainage ditch, and every weathered oak scattered across the property. Some kids grew up learning baseball statistics. I learned property corners. My father used to keep folded survey maps inside a dented green toolbox that smelled like grease, leather, and old paper. Every spring, he spread those maps across the tailgate of his pickup while teaching me why every measurement mattered. He would tap a faded boundary line with one rough finger and say, "The land remembers even when people forget." At the time, I thought it sounded like something only old farmers believed. Years later, I realized he was right. After he passed away, I inherited everything exactly as he intended. The house sat on the northern ridge overlooking the pasture, while the southern acreage remained untouched except for a gravel access trail and a small equipment shed. Friends constantly asked why I never sold that section to developers. Realtors mailed offers every month. Investors knocked on my door promising easy money. I always gave them the same answer. Some things are worth more than the number written on a check. That field held memories no appraisal could calculate. My father planted wildflowers there every spring because my mother loved watching butterflies gather along the fence. The old cedar tree near the creek still carried faint initials my grandfather carved during the summer he proposed to my grandmother. Even after all these years, the place still smelled the same after a hard rain. Damp soil, fresh grass, and cedar drifting through cool morning air. Every visit reminded me why I never considered selling a single square foot. I worked as a civil survey consultant, which probably explains why boundary lines fascinated me more than most people. My job took me across the state reviewing plats, easements, legal descriptions, and construction surveys. I spent thousands of hours studying property records, and if there was one lesson the profession taught me, it was that assumptions create expensive mistakes. That was exactly why I hired an independent survey crew every few years, even though I already knew where every corner stood. Documentation mattered. Photographs mattered. Records mattered. 6 months before Patricia announced her so-called community beautification campaign, I had another complete survey performed after replacing part of the old livestock fence. Every iron monument was verified. Every coordinate matched county records. The surveyor even joked that my paperwork was better organized than most commercial developers. I laughed because he was probably right. I scanned every document into cloud storage that same evening and filed printed copies inside a waterproof cabinet in my office. Those habits were never about preparing for a fight. They were simply how my father taught me to respect what belonged to our family. Looking back now, I cannot help noticing the small signs that something strange was already happening. Neighbors I had never met suddenly started walking farther into the southern field while pointing toward the tree line. A real estate brochure appeared in my mailbox showing a concept drawing of expanded neighborhood green space that looked suspiciously familiar. Then one Saturday morning, I found bright orange utility flags pushed into the grass near the property boundary. I removed them because no one had requested permission to perform any work. 2 days later, fresh flags appeared in exactly the same places. I photographed every one before pulling them out again. At the time, I assumed it was a simple surveying mistake. I still believed common sense would solve everything. I had no idea that while I was carefully preserving decades of history, someone else had already started treating my family's land like an empty space waiting to become their next community project. Patricia Holloway had a talent for making ordinary people believe she was doing them a favor while quietly convincing them to give up something that belonged to them. By the time I met her in person, she had already spent nearly 6 years as president of Hollow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Everyone in the subdivision knew exactly when she arrived, because her pearl-white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled through the entrance every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, polished so perfectly it reflected the oak trees like a mirror. She dressed as if every neighborhood board meeting was a television appearance. Bright designer jackets, oversized jewelry that caught the sunlight from 50 feet away, expensive handbags hanging from one arm, and enough perfume to announce her presence before she even stepped out of the vehicle. She always smiled first. That smile lasted exactly until someone disagreed with her. Then her voice became sharp enough to make even confident people second-guess themselves. Residents described her as passionate about protecting property values. Contractors described her as impossible to satisfy. County employees became strangely quiet whenever her name came up. The first time she visited my property happened almost 4 months before the tree planting event. I heard tires crunch across my gravel driveway while I was repairing a section of fencing near the equipment shed. She climbed out of her vehicle without waiting for an invitation and looked across the southern field through oversized sunglasses. She never introduced herself. She simply asked, "Have you ever considered donating part of this land for the neighborhood?" I smiled politely and told her no. She laughed as though I had misunderstood the question. "You are not really using it." I looked across the pasture where tall grass moved with the afternoon breeze. "My family has been using it for 60 years. She tilted her head slightly. "Unused green space does not help anyone." I answered, "Private property does not have to justify its existence." That was the first moment I noticed the smile disappear. She changed the subject almost immediately and began talking about community growth, walking trails, butterfly gardens, and increasing home values. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Every promise centered on what everyone else would gain. Not once did she ask why the land mattered to me. Before leaving, she handed me a glossy brochure showing a proposed expansion of neighborhood green space. I recognized the shape of the drawing immediately. The southern boundary matched my property almost perfectly. I folded the brochure and thanked her for stopping by. She drove away looking slightly annoyed, but I assumed that would be the end of it. Instead, her campaign quietly accelerated. A week later, I noticed professionally printed concept boards displayed outside the subdivision clubhouse. They showed smiling families walking beneath mature oak trees exactly where my field sat. Another illustration included benches, decorative lighting, and a bronze welcome sign positioned almost precisely where my old survey marker stood. The drawings never listed my parcel number or my name. They simply labeled the area Future Community Greenbelt. That wording bothered me more than the artwork itself. Future implied someone had already decided the outcome. Curious, I attended the next public homeowners meeting even though I was not a member of the association because my property had always remained outside their jurisdiction. Patricia greeted everyone warmly before noticing me near the back of the room. For a split second her expression tightened, then the polished smile returned. During the presentation, she spoke enthusiastically about preserving nature, creating beautiful spaces for children, and strengthening neighborhood identity. The audience applauded several times. Then she pointed toward a large display map. Without mentioning me by name, she referred to one section as currently underutilized land adjacent to the community. I raised my hand and calmly explained that the parcel belonged to me and had never been offered for any project. The room became noticeably quieter. Patricia barely hesitated. "We are simply exploring possibilities," she replied with another practiced smile. Several residents nodded as though that settled everything. I walked out with an uneasy feeling I could not fully explain. It was not because of what she had said. It was because of how confidently she said it. She spoke as though ownership was merely an inconvenience waiting to be negotiated away. As I drove home that evening, the sunset cast long shadows across the same field my grandfather once called the heart of our family. Looking back now, that meeting was never about landscaping. It was the moment Patricia convinced herself that if she repeated the same story often enough, people would eventually believe my land already belonged to everyone except me. I decided that if this situation ever reached a courtroom, I wanted every fact to speak louder than every opinion. The morning after that homeowners meeting, I drove straight to the county records office and requested another certified copy of my property survey, the original deed, and every recorded boundary description tied to my parcel. The clerk behind the counter smiled when she saw my name because I had been there often enough over the years to verify easements for work. 20 minutes later, I walked back to my truck with a fresh folder, official copies, and the quiet confidence that comes from seeing the same legal description repeated over decades without a single change. That afternoon, I sent Patricia a respectful email attaching the certified survey. I highlighted the boundary lines, included aerial photographs, and politely explained that no landscaping, grading, or construction could take place anywhere inside my property without written permission. I even offered to meet her on site so we could walk the boundary together. She replied the next morning with only 2 sentences. She thanked me for my concern and said the association had already completed its own review. There was no explanation, no request to compare documents, and no indication that she had even opened the attachments. Instead of arguing, I mailed the same information through certified mail with delivery confirmation. A week later, the signed receipt came back. I scanned it into my records and placed the original inside the same waterproof cabinet that held every survey my family had ever saved. Then I installed 3 temporary signs along the southern boundary. Each one clearly stated that the property was privately owned and that any entry for landscaping or improvements required the owner's written authorization. The signs were impossible to miss. Bright white backgrounds, bold black lettering, and reflective strips that caught headlights after sunset. 2 mornings later, I found one lying face down in the grass. The post had not been broken. Someone had simply pulled it out and tossed it aside. I photographed it before putting it back exactly where it belonged. The following week, another sign disappeared completely. I documented that as well. Around the same time, fresh wooden stakes appeared deeper inside the field, each topped with bright orange ribbon fluttering in the wind. They were arranged in curved lines instead of straight property boundaries, almost as if someone had already mapped future planting beds. I measured their locations with my handheld global positioning system unit, photographed every marker, and logged the coordinates with timestamps. My profession had taught me one simple habit: never rely on memory when evidence can be preserved. As the weeks passed, the activity increased. Pickup trucks carrying landscaping supplies began driving through the subdivision more frequently. I noticed pallets of stone edging stacked behind the clubhouse and bundles of irrigation pipe sitting beneath blue tarps. One Saturday morning, I watched a contractor unload several large trees into a temporary holding area near the neighborhood entrance. None of that proved they intended to cross onto my land, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. I sent Patricia one final certified letter. This one was direct, but still professional. I explained that I had documented every communication, every boundary marker, and every warning already provided. I requested written confirmation that no work would occur on my property and reminded her that any unauthorized installation could create unnecessary legal and financial consequences. The delivery receipt showed it arrived 2 days later. There was never a response. Instead, a colorful announcement appeared on the subdivision social media page promoting an upcoming community tree day. Families were encouraged to bring cameras. Children were invited to help plant trees, and local media would attend to celebrate what Patricia described as a lasting gift to the neighborhood. As I studied the promotional map attached to the announcement, my eyes stopped on one familiar outline. It matched the southern edge of my family's field almost perfectly. That was the moment I stopped hoping common sense would solve the problem. From then on, I simply kept documenting everything, because sometimes the strongest response is not the loudest one. It is the one that leaves no room for doubt later. By the end of that week, the story had already changed, at least according to everyone except the people who actually owned the land. Patricia posted cheerful photographs every afternoon showing volunteers unloading decorative stone, irrigation supplies, and rows of healthy young oak trees. Her captions praised community spirit and thanked residents for supporting what she called a legacy project that would benefit future generations. Hundreds of comments followed. People posted heart emojis, congratulated the board, and talked about bringing their grandchildren to enjoy the new green space. Very few questioned where the land actually belonged. Why would they? They trusted the person speaking the loudest. I decided not to argue in the comments. Social media rarely changes minds, and every emotional response only creates another distraction from the facts. Instead, I downloaded every public post, captured screenshots with visible dates and timestamps, and saved copies into the same evidence folder that now seemed to grow larger every day. Every photograph accidentally documented another detail: fresh survey paint, delivery trucks, rental equipment, pallets of mulch, irrigation trenches, workers installing edging stones. Patricia smiling beside each new addition as though she personally owned every inch beneath her expensive shoes. A few neighbors eventually reached out to me privately. One elderly couple apologized because they honestly believed the field had already been donated. Another man quietly asked if I planned to sell the property after the project was finished. That question stayed with me for hours. Finished. People already believed the decision had been made. The narrative had moved so far ahead of reality that ownership itself was becoming an afterthought. I contacted the county planning office simply to verify whether any permits had been issued that affected my parcel. The employee I spoke with was courteous and confirmed there were no approved changes to my property records. He suggested that if unauthorized work occurred, it would likely become a private civil matter unless another regulation had been violated. It was not the dramatic answer many people imagine hearing, but it was honest, and honesty usually moves slower than assumptions. I thanked him, documented the conversation in my notebook, and continued gathering information instead of chasing quick victories. A few days later, I drove past the subdivision entrance just after sunrise. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh pine bark. Contractors were already unloading additional landscaping materials, while Patricia stood nearby holding a clipboard and greeting volunteers with pastries and coffee. She looked completely relaxed, laughing with residents and posing for more photographs. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a neighborhood improvement project. That was exactly what made it so effective. Ordinary appearances often hide extraordinary mistakes. I parked along the public road, photographed the equipment from a lawful location, and left without speaking to anyone. I knew exactly what Patricia expected. She wanted a confrontation that could be described as an angry landowner opposing families and community volunteers. I refused to give her that picture. Every hour she continued without acknowledging my written notices only strengthened the timeline I had already built. Every new installation increased the amount of work that would eventually have to be undone. Every cheerful announcement became another record showing the project moved forward despite repeated warnings. Looking back now, those days tested my patience more than anything that happened afterward. Watching people celebrate improvements on land that had belonged to my family for generations was not easy. Still, my father had always repeated one lesson whenever we walked property lines together. Measure twice, move once. The same principle applied here. I could not control how loudly Patricia promoted her version of events, but I could control how carefully I documented the truth. While she invested more money into appearances, I invested more time into evidence. She believed momentum would eventually replace ownership. I believed facts would eventually catch up with momentum. Neither of us changed course, and with every sunrise the distance between those two beliefs grew a little wider. 3 days after the community celebration, I finally sat down with someone who cared more about documents than opinions. My attorney, Daniel Mercer, had spent nearly 30 years handling property disputes, and his office reflected exactly that. Shelves overflowed with survey books, county plats, and thick binders whose pages had yellowed long before computers became standard. The faint smell of coffee and old paper filled the room as I spread my evidence across his conference table. Certified surveys, recorded deeds, photographs, electronic mail correspondence, certified mail receipts, global positioning system coordinates, screenshots of Patricia's public announcements, drone photographs showing every stage of the landscaping project. Daniel barely interrupted while I explained the timeline. When I finally finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and quietly asked one question. Did they ever acknowledge receiving your notices? I slid 2 green certified mail receipts across the table. Both carried signatures confirming delivery. Then I opened my laptop and showed him Patricia's email thanking me for my concern, while stating that the association had already completed its own review. He read every line twice before looking up with a slow smile. This changes everything. I asked what he meant. He pointed to the stack of correspondence between us. People make mistakes all the time. Courts understand honest mistakes. But continuing after repeated notice becomes much harder to explain. He organized every document into chronological order until the entire story could be followed without either of us saying another word. First came the certified survey confirming ownership, then my written request to avoid entering the property, then the certified letters, then photographs showing warning signs installed along the boundary, then documentation showing the signs removed or displaced. After that came Patricia's public announcements inviting volunteers to improve land that she had already been warned did not belong to the association. Finally came the photographs and videos of mature trees, irrigation lines, decorative stone, and permanent landscaping installed anyway. The evidence almost assembled itself. Daniel asked whether the boundary monuments still remained in place. I nodded. Every one of them. He smiled again. Excellent. 2 days later we met an independent licensed surveyor named Rebecca Collins at the property. The morning air still carried the clean scent of damp grass from an overnight rain. Rebecca unloaded precision surveying equipment with calm efficiency while I watched from the edge of the field. Patricia drove by once in her sport utility vehicle, but never stopped. She slowed just enough to see what we were doing before continuing toward the subdivision entrance. Rebecca spent several hours locating every recorded monument, verifying bearings, and measuring each improvement that crossed onto my land. Every oak tree, every irrigation valve, every section of decorative edging, every bronze sign. Nothing was estimated. Every measurement was documented with professional precision. Before leaving, she handed me a preliminary field sketch and quietly said, "There is no ambiguity here." Those 5 words carried more weight than the loudest neighborhood meeting ever could. Later that afternoon, Daniel called with another recommendation. Give them one final opportunity. At first, I questioned the idea. We had already warned them repeatedly. Daniel explained that another written notice would eliminate any remaining argument that the association lacked an opportunity to correct the problem voluntarily. The next morning, he drafted a formal demand letter. It included the updated survey, photographs, copies of previous correspondence, and a clear request that every unauthorized improvement be removed from my property within a reasonable deadline. The letter also stated that if no action was taken, I intended to exercise my rights through lawful channels to restore my property. There were no threats, no dramatic language, only facts supported by documents. We mailed the package by certified delivery and by overnight courier. 2 days later, both tracking numbers confirmed successful delivery. That same evening, Patricia posted another smiling photograph online. She stood beneath one of the newly planted oak trees with several residents gathered around her. Her caption thanked everyone for helping create a permanent gift for future generations. I studied the picture for a long moment before closing my laptop. She had received every survey, every warning, every opportunity to step back. Instead, she had publicly celebrated moving forward. Sitting alone on my back porch as the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar across the field, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting for Patricia to make the right decision. She had already made hers. Now the timeline belonged to the documents, and documents have a way of remembering every choice people wish they had handled differently. The deadline expired on a quiet Thursday afternoon. No trucks arrived to remove the trees. No contractors returned to dismantle the irrigation system. No phone call came from Patricia. The only thing that appeared in my mailbox was another glossy neighborhood newsletter celebrating the success of the beautification project. The front page featured smiling volunteers standing beneath the very oak trees rooted inside my property. Patricia occupied the center of the photograph with one hand resting proudly on the bronze community sign. Underneath the picture, the headline described the project as a permanent investment in the future of Hollow Creek Estates. Water arced through the morning light, feeding trees that had never belonged there in the first place. Daniel stood quietly beside one of the survey monuments before looking across the field. "They made a very deliberate decision," he said. I nodded. "Now we make ours." Over the next several days, we assembled a team that valued precision more than drama. Rebecca Collins completed her final certified survey report with measurements identifying every unauthorized improvement. Daniel finalized the legal notices confirming that multiple opportunities had been provided for voluntary removal. I contacted a licensed arborist whose company specialized in safely relocating mature trees whenever possible. His first question surprised me. "Are you trying to save them?" I answered immediately. "Every healthy tree deserves that chance." He smiled and explained that with the proper equipment, many could be transplanted instead of destroyed. That answer mattered to me. This had never been about the trees. It had always been about respecting boundaries. I also hired a professional excavation contractor capable of removing irrigation components without unnecessary damage to the surrounding soil. Every company received copies of the certified survey, so there would be no uncertainty regarding the property lines. Every conversation was documented. Every estimate was written. Every schedule was confirmed in advance. By the middle of the following week, the plan looked less like retaliation and more like a carefully organized construction project. Survey crews would identify every legal boundary before any equipment moved. The arborist would relocate salvageable trees to a licensed nursery. Irrigation lines installed inside my property would be removed systematically. Decorative stone would be stacked neatly for collection. Nothing would happen outside the documented property limits. Nothing would rely on assumptions. Daniel reviewed the entire schedule one final time before looking at me across his conference table. "One more notice," he said. I almost laughed. "Another one?" He nodded. "Not because they deserve it. Because complete documentation leaves very little room for misunderstanding. We sent one final courtesy notification explaining the exact date work would begin if the unauthorized improvements remained in place. It included the certified survey once again, copies of previous correspondence, and the completed report prepared by Rebecca. Delivery confirmation arrived the next afternoon. The response came less than 24 hours later. Patricia sent a brief electronic mail message stating that the association rejected my position entirely and considered the landscaping to be a permanent community asset. She concluded by saying that any attempt to interfere would be viewed very seriously. Daniel read the message without changing his expression. Then he quietly printed another copy and added it to the binder. "She just documented her own decision," he said. That evening I drove slowly along the edge of the field as the sun settled behind the tree line. Families walked nearby, children pointed toward the new landscaping, and sprinklers continued their steady rhythm across the grass. Everything looked peaceful. That almost made the situation more surreal. I stopped beside the old iron survey monument where my father once taught me that boundaries exist whether people choose to acknowledge them or not. The cool steel felt unchanged beneath my hand, just as solid as it had been decades earlier. Looking across the field, I realized every warning had now been given. Every opportunity had been offered. Every document had been delivered. The next morning would not begin a conflict. It would simply begin restoring something that had never stopped belonging to my family. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, the first diesel engine echoed across the pasture. Cool air carried the scent of wet grass, cedar, and freshly brewed coffee from the insulated cup sitting on the tailgate of my truck. I watched the convoy arrive one vehicle at a time, exactly according to the schedule we had spent days preparing. Rebecca Collins stepped out first with her survey equipment. Daniel Mercer arrived a few minutes later carrying 2 binders filled with every document we had assembled over the previous several weeks. Behind them came the licensed arborist and his crew, followed by the excavation contractor with equipment designed to remove irrigation lines carefully instead of tearing up the surrounding soil. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. Before a single machine crossed the property line, Rebecca located every survey monument once again. Bright marking flags appeared beside each legal boundary, while her equipment confirmed every measurement recorded in the certified survey. Daniel quietly handed copies of the survey to every crew leader, reminding them that no work would occur outside the documented limits. It felt less like a confrontation and more like the beginning of a carefully managed construction project. The first mature oak was prepared for relocation shortly after 8 o'clock. Specialized equipment surrounded the root system while the arborist explained each step to his crew. The machine lifted the tree slowly, keeping the root ball intact before placing it onto a transport trailer headed for a licensed nursery. Watching that first tree leave the field felt strangely satisfying because it proved something important. Respecting property rights did not require destroying something beautiful. It only required putting it in the right place. One by one, the remaining trees followed the same process. Irrigation valves were shut off. Water lines were exposed carefully and disconnected without unnecessary disturbance to the surrounding ground. Decorative stone was stacked neatly onto pallets. The bronze community sign that had welcomed visitors only days earlier was unbolted, wrapped in protective blankets, and loaded onto a flatbed for removal. Everything happened quietly. The loudest sounds were hydraulic equipment, backup alarms, and birds returning to the open field as each section was restored. Around mid-morning, another familiar sound drifted across the pasture. Tires crunched sharply over gravel before Patricia's white sport utility vehicle stopped near the entrance. She climbed out wearing another brightly colored designer jacket, oversized sunglasses, and enough jewelry to catch the morning sunlight from every direction. She looked across the field in complete disbelief. For several seconds, she simply stared as another oak tree rose into the air on the arborist's equipment. Then she walked quickly toward Daniel. I remained where I was beside the survey marker while they spoke. Daniel calmly handed her another copy of the certified survey and the correspondence documenting every notice that had been delivered before any work began. She flipped through several pages, looked toward the crews, then back at the documents. Whatever she wanted to argue seemed to fade as she realized every step taking place around her matched the paperwork in her hands. Residents gradually gathered along the subdivision sidewalk, many holding phones while quietly watching the operation unfold. Some looked confused. Others appeared surprised that every contractor worked with such precision. A few recognized the survey flags and began asking one another where the actual property line had always been. For the first time since this situation began, people were no longer relying on assumptions. They were watching documented boundaries being followed with remarkable accuracy. By early afternoon, the transformation was almost complete. The irrigation trenches had been restored with clean topsoil. Fresh grading blended naturally into the surrounding pasture. The bronze sign was gone. Every unauthorized tree had either been relocated or prepared for transport. The field looked remarkably similar to the way it had before the project began, except now every step of its restoration had been photographed, surveyed, and documented just as carefully as the unauthorized installation itself. As the last trailer pulled away, I walked to the old iron survey monument where my father had once rested his hand while teaching me that land remembers even when people forget. The breeze moved gently across the open grass, carrying the familiar scent of cedar once again. I looked across the restored field and realized that nothing dramatic had happened at all. No shouting, no chaos, no spectacle, just patient preparation, careful documentation, and lawful action carried through exactly as planned. In the end, the loudest statement anyone made that day was not spoken by a person. It was written by every property line that had quietly remained in the same place all along. Over the following weeks, life settled back into a rhythm that felt familiar again. Early morning sunlight stretched across the open pasture exactly as it had when I was a kid, following my father from fence post to fence post with muddy boots and more questions than answers. The breeze once again carried the scent of cedar, wild grass, and fresh earth instead of new mulch and decorative landscaping. Standing there one quiet Saturday morning, it almost felt as though the field had taken a deep breath after holding it for far too long. The only new addition I made was a simple wooden fence placed precisely along the certified boundary, built with pressure-treated posts and plain wire exactly the way my grandfather always preferred. Near the entrance, I installed a modest metal sign that read, "Private property. Thank you for respecting the boundary." Nothing flashy, nothing confrontational, just a clear reminder that respect begins with recognizing where someone else's property starts. The response throughout the neighborhood changed gradually. A few residents stopped by to apologize after learning what had actually happened. Several admitted they had believed the project had been approved because they trusted the information presented to them. I never blamed them. Most people simply assumed someone had already confirmed the facts before investing so much money and effort. Others quietly thanked me for remaining calm throughout the entire situation instead of turning it into a public spectacle. They told me watching everything unfold had reminded them that patience and preparation often accomplish more than anger ever could. Even the local reporter who had covered Community Tree Day returned several weeks later asking if I would share my side of the story. I agreed on one condition. I did not want anyone embarrassed or ridiculed. I only wanted the importance of respecting property rights and verifying facts before making assumptions to become the focus. To my surprise, that was exactly how the story was presented. Looking back, I never enjoyed seeing anyone face the consequences of poor decisions. I certainly did not celebrate the time, expense, or inconvenience created by undoing work that never should have happened in the first place. But I also understood something my father repeated every time we walked those property lines together. Boundaries are not obstacles. They are promises. They allow neighbors to live peacefully because everyone knows where responsibility begins and where it ends. Ignore those boundaries long enough, and eventually reality has a way of reintroducing them. Months later, I visited the licensed nursery where many of the relocated oak trees had been transplanted. Seeing healthy green leaves stretching toward the sky brought an unexpected sense of relief. The trees had been given another chance in a place where they actually belonged. Somehow that felt like the most fitting ending possible. Nothing valuable had been wasted. It had simply been moved to the proper location. As for Patricia, I rarely saw her after that season. New faces eventually appeared at association meetings, and conversations around the neighborhood shifted toward practical improvements that respected both community interests and individual property rights. Time moved forward, just as it always does. Yet every time I walk past that old iron survey monument, I still hear my father's voice reminding me that the land remembers even when people forget. He was right. Every document we preserved, every photograph we took, every respectful warning we delivered, and every careful decision we made became part of that memory as well. Justice never arrived with shouting or revenge. It arrived through patience, preparation, and the quiet strength of letting the truth stand on its own. If there is one lesson I carried away from all of this, it is that protecting what is yours does not require becoming someone you are not. It requires knowing the facts, respecting the law, and refusing to let emotion replace evidence. I would genuinely like to know what you think after hearing this story. Do you believe I handled the situation the right way, or would you have done something differently if you had been standing in my boots? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives. And if stories about standing up for what is right through patience, preparation, and lawful action are the kind you enjoy, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Until then, remember this: justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply the quiet moment when the truth finally stands exactly where it has belonged all along.